These days, we hear more and more about disinformation or fake news, as some may like to call it. Many blame social media and point the finger at big tech platforms such as Facebook or X, formerly known as Twitter, or TikTok, for enabling the spread. Now, several African countries are considering banning some of these platforms. Last week, for instance, Somalia banned TikTok and Telegram. And in Kenya, members of parliament have been discussing similar restrictions for TikTok. The argument is that these social media platforms allow disinformation to thrive and influence social discourse, causing harm, notably during conflicts or important events like national elections. To talk more about this, we've invited Odanga Madung onto the program. He is a data journalist and researcher for Mozilla. That's the nonprofit behind the Firefox browser. Odanga has been recognized for his work looking into how social media platforms are impacting political discourse. It's really good to have you on the program. Perhaps you want to just start by you telling us a little bit about the research that you did in Kenya to hold tech firms accountable for the influence that they have. What did you find?
So I've been looking into how the artificial intelligence systems of social media companies have been fueling the spread of mis and disinformation within the ecosystems of African countries. And my research specifically focused on how these systems are perpetuating disinformation and hate speech, especially during last year's general elections in Kenya.
Right. And so when we talk about disinformation here, this is, of course, a universal challenge. We know that a number of countries around the world have flagged concerns about the disinformation that voting public access, specifically around elections, etc. So this is a universal challenge. But in the African context, how much of a problem is it, given that much of our electorate don't necessarily have access to these platforms?
Well, I would say that the idea that the African continent is not as connected as it used to be is an idea that perhaps needs to move on. There are very many Africans that are connected to the internet and are currently engaging within social media platforms currently. Kenya itself has 11 million users. Tanzania itself also has quite tens of millions of users. And, collectively, we are talking about a population of almost 200 million people within the continent that are connected to the internet and connected to the internet primarily through the use of social media applications. So I do believe that the influence of such kinds of nefarious activities, such as the spread of mis and disinformation, actually still do have a chance to have some very serious imprint within the population. And secondly, it's very important to consider the fact that what happens online does not stay online. Things that happen online have an equal influence on the things that end up happening offline. And there are very many cases where we have seen, misinformation that started circling on platforms digitally has ended up manifesting itself in the real world. So one of the things that we have in Kenya is, for the longest time, we have had a very big problem with what we call election denialism, right? Where certain parties will oftentimes refuse to accept defeat within a certain election, or there will be a lot of unverified information that is spreading around during election time, appertaining to whether someone has won or not. And in this specific case, in Kenya, one of the things that we saw was that we had a case whereby everyone was trying to declare themselves a winner, which led to quite a sharp rise in anxiety amongst the electorate. Now, the reason this is a problem is that because we have a very long history of election violence, or rather of post-election violence occurring within the country, and most recently, especially within 2017 and 2007, that come to mind. And that is something that we have to take note of because, for example, hate speech that is spread through the use of social media platforms poses a real danger to a lot of people because it can very easily turn into offline violence as well.
So what then, Odanga, would you say is your message, and who is this message being directed to? Are you saying that we need to regulate these platforms? Are you speaking to users directly? How are we going to safeguard our democracies in a way from this disinformation that, as you say, doesn't stay online but really manifests itself in the real world?
The one thing that I would say is that it's time to have a conversation about how to regulate the activities of tech giants platforms within the African continent. And this is not something that can merely happen within one country. It's something that needs to happen across the board. Recently, we've been seeing that there's been a very big trend recently of TikTok bans happening across Africa. Banning is not necessarily the answer to the question that we're trying, rather it's not necessarily the answer to the questions that we're asking. What we need to do is have a conversation about what content is allowed to manifest within these platforms and what content is not, and the systems that and the system that has been designed in this space. What exactly does it allow to spread within it? What kind of values does it foster? And we as a continent, what are we looking to get out of this? Because largely this conversation has been led by the platforms and not necessarily by African citizens themselves. Because remember, social media companies and social media platforms are here to serve as products, right? We will end up in a case whereby, as we have seen with many other global corporations, that the best of the best quality of social media platform is likely going to be served towards majority Western countries. And the very worst of the platform is probably going to be delivered to poor global South countries. These are companies that are there to make profits. And we need to understand it from that perspective.
All right, that's Odanga Badung talking to us from Nairobi. We appreciate your insights. Thank you.